I want to tell you about the darkest period in Irish history, a time that we will never forget, or that we should never forget. It had affected every person in Ireland. It crept silently into every corner of our land and home. I am talking about the Irish Famine, or the Great Hunger, or as the Irish used to call it back then, on Gortmore. The famine occurred between 1845 and 1852, and it decimated the Irish population. 1 million people died of starvation and 2 million people fled the country on coffin ships, most of them never reaching their destination, having perished on the journey. It was one of the greatest mass exodus from a single island in history. The proximate cause of the famine was a potato blight, which infected potato crops. Other causes were absentee landlords and single crop dependence. The famine and its effects permanently changed the island's demographic, political and cultural landscape, producing an estimated 2 million refugees and spurring a century-long population decline. The strained relations between the Irish and their ruling British government worsened further because of the famine, heightened ethnic and sectarian tensions, and boosted nationalism and republican views both here and among Irish immigrants around the world. The famine became part of a long story of betrayal and exploitation which led to the growing movement for independence. No issue provoked as much anger between Ireland and England as the indisputable fact that huge quantities of food were exported from Ireland to England throughout the period when the people of Ireland were dying of starvation. Although the potato crop failed, the country was still producing and exporting more than enough food to feed the population. In 1847, the worst year of the famine, almost 4,000 ships carrying food left Irish shores for Britain. The vast export trade suggests the diversity of the Irish economy during these years and how disease and starvation existed side by side with a sustainable commercial sector, which made people ask the question, was it a famine or was it genocide? As the famine took hold, people could not pay their rent, so the English landlords began evicting the poor tenants from their small plots. But the great mass of evictions came in 1847. Over 500,000 people were evicted from their homes during this period. West Clare was one of the worst areas for evictions. Landlords turned thousands of families out and demolished their pitiful cabins. In April 1848, it was estimated that 1,000 homes with an average of 6 people each had been levelled. The Mahon family of Strokestown House evicted 3,000 people in 1847 and were still able to dine on lobster soup. Bishop of Meath, Thomas Nulty, described his personal recollection of the evictions. 700 human beings were driven from their homes in one day and set adrift on the world. The horrid scenes I then witnessed, I must remember all of my life. The wailing of women, the screams, the terror, the consternation of children, the speechless agony of honest, industrious men wrung tears of grief from all who saw them. I saw officers and men of a large police force who were obliged to attend on the occasion cry like children at beholding the cruel suffering of the very people whom they were obliged to butcher had they offered the least resistance. Landlords warned other tenants against the humanity of extending any of them the hospitality of a single night's shelter, and little more than 3 years, nearly a quarter of them lay quietly in their graves. I'm now standing at the entrance of the Rathkeale workhouse, which is now a meat processing plant. Some of the original building still stands today. This was the last road for a lot of poor souls. It operated as a workhouse until 1921, when the IRA burnt it to the ground to prevent the British Army using it as a base. Soup kitchens were set up to relieve some of the suffering, and eventually workhouses were opened. The British government introduced workhouses in 1838, believing them to be the most cost-effective way of tackling the desperate state of poverty in Ireland. Some English politicians also believed that it would prevent the Irish destitute from swarming England. There was 163 workhouses in Ireland in total. If people could not support themselves, they could work for food in these workhouses. The workhouse in Rathkeale opened in 1841 at a cost of £7,600 and was built to house a maximum of 660 inmates, but at its capacity it was holding over 3,000. The Rathkeale workhouse was built to accommodate people from Rathkeale and the neighbouring towns such as Adair, Skeeton, Croke, Kildimo, Ballingarry and Shanagolden. Life in the workhouse was very harsh so as not to encourage people to stay. One of the cruelest aspects of the workhouse was the segregation of family members on entering. Men were in one section and children aged 2 or less stayed with their mothers, and boys and girls were in another part of the workhouse. Illegitimate children were also born here, and in the last 6 months of 1853, 671 illegitimate babies were born in workhouses all over Ireland. Severe beatings and periods of confinement were imposed for those who transgressed, as when 2 small boys were flogged in public by the schoolmaster in Limerick workhouse for having marked a desk. The quality of milk was also an issue, with allegations that none was provided for weeks and that chalk was added and gruel was substituted at times. Officials also used money for their own provisions such as butter. No clothing was provided, and a visitor to Kilrush workhouse observed children were mere skeletons with no flesh on their bones and dressed in rags. In the worst year of the famine, Black 47, 600 famine pots were sent to Ireland by the British to relieve the suffering in the workhouses. These famine pots, or workhouse pots as they were known, were essential in feeding the starving, as they could hold everything, and everything could be cooked in them, including nettles, wild herbs and bones. Gruel was also supplied in these. A further 294 pots were donated by the Quakers. These pots were made of cast iron and came in a variety of sizes, and as you can see from the sheer scale of this one, just how many people it was actually feeding. These famine pots tell an important story about the history of our famine. Mortality rates among children were high, especially those under 2 years of age. The greatest concern was that what to do with the children once they reached a certain age. Boys were placed in the army or navy, but girls were of a greater worry. Between 1848 and 1849, 20,000 girls were deported to the colonies, mainly Australia, where there was a shortage of women for marriage. These girls never saw home again. Children who had to avail of the workhouse during the Irish Famine were a lost generation, deprived of their childhood and ill-prepared for the future role in society. For young children, admission to the workhouse was an entrance to the grave. Because of the frequency of death, there was no attendance at funerals either, because people were too sick or afraid to attend because of disease. As people stopped attending funerals, traditions soon ended. It had long been a tradition that women present at funerals in Ireland would be heard crying and wailing as the body of the deceased was lowered into the ground. They were called keeners. All of this stopped. Instead, people were buried silently and sadly, and nobody said a word. Death had escalated so much that there was not enough coffins, so people were buried in cloth. For convenience, coffins were made in 3 sizes: 6'3", 5'8" and 4 foot. Everyone, young and old, had to make do with these sizes. Mount Mellick in County Laois, guardians were accused of burying people in a pit, and in some cases 2 to a coffin. No humanity was shown to these people in their final resting place. Within a short period of time, death became an overwhelming feature of everyday life in Ireland. Normal funeral practice was quickly forgotten. Soon there was not enough people to help with the burial of the dead. In Cork City, the police had to carry out the burial of 21 people because no one else could. In County Roscommon, a poor man, weak from fever, endeavouring to bury his son, fell into the grave alongside him dead. By August, the number of burials in Tuam County got described as almost incredible. The famine mass graves, or pits as they were known, were the final resting place of the victims of the famine. During these mass burials, there were reports of people being buried alive. This happened when people collapsed due to disease and hunger, and in their weakened state, they were presumed dead. Tom Gearan was only 3 years old when he was buried alive in a mass grave in Skibbereen. Such mistakes were not uncommon. The gravedigger accidentally struck his legs with a shovel, causing Tom to moan. Tom survived and was left a cripple for the rest of his life because of his broken legs. He died in 1910 at the age of 65. This was the last journey for a lot of victims, for all the victims from the workhouse from Rathkeale. We're now coming towards the famine graveyard just outside Rathkeale. It's about a mile outside the town, and this is where the carts brought the bodies for burial, most of them in pits. Rathkeale Famine Paupers Graveyard, Relig on Gurta Moor. You are now entering a long abandoned famine graveyard. Here ends Casa Namarov, pathway of death, so named because unnumbered thousands perished following its grim passage from rotten fields to odious workhouse to ignominious burial. May they feel the warmth of a tear, may they hear the piper's lament, may they know we, the survivors, keep vigil. This is the Rathkeale Famine Graveyard, and it is the resting place of thousands of victims of the famine from Rathkeale and the surrounding areas. Just inside the wall here is where all the babies were brought from the cart and laid to rest. They were just laid into graves all along here because it was easier to put the babies just inside the wall. Rathkeale Famine Graveyard is just off the main Limerick-Killarney motorway, a mile outside the town. It was cleared and restored a few years ago by a local voluntary group, Rathkeale Town Action Group, who believed that finally some dignity should be shown to the victims of the Great Hunger. In so doing, they have renewed interest in the people buried there and the circumstances under which they lived. They were motivated by the thought that these people buried here were neglected in death as they had been neglected in life. Their humiliation continued even after death. It may be the current pandemic that has made us realise that we should cherish life itself and our history a little bit more.